With the votes counted and control of Congress split between Republicans and Democrats, it's now clear that the most important long-term consequence of the 2022 midterm election was that Trumpism hit a stone wall out in the country. In several important battleground states, voters simply rejected Donald Trump's brazen attempt at a power grab by pushing his own hand-picked candidates, election deniers, for major state offices all across the country. They went down to defeat in places like New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Alaska. It left the Trump strategy in shambles. It signaled that the tide of Trumpism has hit its peak and is now ebbing among the electorate. And exit polls showed that this was no fluke. People had been listening to those final warnings from President Biden and former President Barack Obama that American democracy was on the ballot, that there was a Trump threat that had to be stopped. In fact, in the Associated Press poll of 94,000 voters all across the country, 44% said that concern about the fate of American democracy was their number one concern, decided their vote. Almost as many as said that it was the economy that was the number one concern. And the other thing that showed up in the balloting was that 10% of them had made up their minds in the final 10 days. And in the election returns, there was evidence of massive Republican defections against Trump candidates, mainstream Republican voters who said they thought Trump candidates were too extreme or not well enough qualified to serve in public office. In fact, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell said that Trumpist candidates had alienated moderate and independent voters with their extreme attacks, their negativism, their chaos, and had cost Republicans some of the votes and some of the victories that he was counting on to gain the majority in the Senate. It's true, the Trump picks did win two important Senate seats in Ohio and North Carolina, two swing states that had been occupied by Republican senators before, and they retired. Trump got those victories. But elsewhere, the Trump picks had a miserable record. Only 7 of the 30 high-profile Trump candidates for major state offices won their elections. In Michigan, they were wiped out. All 4 candidates for governor, senator, secretary of state, and attorney general. Almost the same thing happened in Arizona, which was a very tough battleground state, a big target of the Trump effort to elect state officials. All 3 of the major candidates that the Trump picked and put forward lost. Kari Lake, the fiery, dramatic, flamboyant former Fox News anchor in Phoenix, running for governor. Blake Masters, a right-winger, running for the Senate. And Mark Finchem, running for Secretary of State. Finchem being one of the people who was at the January 6th protest at the U.S. Capitol back in 2021. So these were highly controversial figures, and they all got rejected by Arizona voters. And what's amazing is a low-key, common sense Democratic candidate, Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, was the one who beat the fiery Kari Lake for the governor's race. And in Pennsylvania, the big 2 went down. Dr. Mebadaz running for the U.S. Senate and Doug Mastriano running for the governor's post. And Mastriano was, like Finchem, a participant in the January 6th demonstration at the Capitol and a vigorous purveyor of the stolen election line. And they got rejected there. And in Wisconsin, pro-Trump businessman Tim Michels tried to unseat the Democratic governor, Tony Evers, who's been under enormous pressure in that Republican-dominated state. And they've got so many levers of power that Michels said, if I win this election, Republicans will never lose again in Wisconsin. Evers jumped on that and said, that's disdain for the voters, that's a danger to democracy, and he managed to defeat Tim Michels and the Trumpist challenge. To some election analysts, probably the most dangerous threat from the Trump camp came from its organized effort to elect secretaries of state in 11 states. Now, those are the officials in almost every state who run the elections, administer them, manage them, count the votes, and certify the winners. So that's a very important position that the Trump people were trying to go after. They won in 3 states, but they're all deep red states, Wyoming, Indiana, and Alabama. But elsewhere, the Trump candidates for Secretary of State were rejected by the voters in Connecticut, Vermont, Michigan, Minnesota, Arizona, Nevada, and elsewhere. And the victories against the Trump candidates in Arizona and Nevada were particularly important because those were extremely inflammatory candidates. Jim Marchant in Nevada was the organizer of this Secretary of State effort nationwide. And Mark Fincham, the candidate of the Trump team in Arizona. So those were people that Democrats and constitutional Republicans felt were very important to defeat. It's clear from the election returns that defections among Republican voters had a big impact, and they hurt a number of candidates. Believe it or not, in Georgia. In Georgia, actually, Republican voters rejected the Trump slate back in the Republican primary in May, and they returned Brian Kemp, the sitting governor, who actually certified Trump's defeat and Biden's victory in Georgia in 2020. The one candidate from the Trump camp who won in the primary in Georgia and got into the general election was former University of Georgia football star Herschel Walker, who ran a very close race against the incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock. He might have won, except for Republican defections. There were 200,000 people, Republicans, who voted for Governor Brian Kemp, the mainstream candidate, who refused to vote for Herschel Walker. Now, he's got that same problem facing him when he runs in the runoff against Warnock in December. And in Pennsylvania, there were 250,000 voters who refused to vote for the extremist Republican candidate for governor, and he lost that election badly. So Republican defections hurt the Trumpist team. Trump advocates will point to the fact that they reelected incumbent Republican members of Congress, governors, lieutenant governors, secretaries of state in the deep red states like Texas, Florida, Alabama, and even in the Midwest, Iowa, Missouri, and the Dakotas. It's true. There are probably a couple hundred of those candidates who have either challenged the 2020 election results, denied it outright, or raised questions about it. But that's basically an affirmation of the status quo. The real test in the 2022 election was the push by the Trump camp to expand its perimeter, to move into the battleground states, which often decide presidential elections. And there they failed badly. They were rejected. The Trump big lie did not sell in those states. It turned voters off, and they have stemmed the tide, and the fact of their verdict against Trump and Trumpism will have a big impact in 2024. So thanks for viewing us. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll take a moment and click on that little button down there and look at some other of our videos, and then click on that button down there and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to have you come back. Thanks for being with us.